Coming up on this episode of Crime Family. Even before Tina's body was found in the Red River, there had been tragedy surrounding it. Police discovered a severed leg that had washed up on the shore of the Red River. And then 5 days after that, a man that was out for a walk found an arm that had washed up on shore as well. Volunteers found bones at the bottom of the river. They found a blood-stained pillowcase, a bloody carpet, and there was dentures found that were all handed over to the police. In 2015, they found teeth scattered along the shore. So these are all examples of they're finding things in the river. So there are thousands of missing and murdered Indigenous women across Canada that have not seen justice, and these are just some of their stories that we're gonna represent here.
We could have a whole series of just cases of Indigenous women.
This is not some ancient history of our past. It starts then, but reaches into modern times.
Hi everyone, welcome to Crime Family. Today I'm going to talk about one of Canada's most urgent and tragic realities. Canada has a reputation of being a country full of really super nice and polite people, and while that may be true, it has a really dark history, and it's one that has largely been swept under the rug for over a century. It's a history of genocide of the Indigenous people of our country. When I think back to middle school and high school social studies classes, learning about the injustices against the Indigenous people really does not stand out to me as a focus of any of those lessons. What do you guys remember learning about this subject in school?
I don't really remember learning about the injustices of the Indigenous community really at all. We learned a little bit about the history of some of the Indigenous people in Nova Scotia itself, but we didn't learn the dark side of history of residential schools. Maybe we touched on it, but definitely not to the extent that I think was required or that we needed.
Yeah, I have no recollection of ever learning about the injustice of Indigenous people. All I remember learning about was the way they hunted, the way they lived their lives on the land. I don't remember any of the dark side of that. I don't remember learning anything about that.
Yeah, I remember, I'm pretty sure I learned more about that dark side of it in the last couple of years than I ever did in school.
Yeah, same with me.
Yeah, I know. I feel the same too. They really kind of shoved the European settlers down our throat. I know a ton about that. I mean, that's still a part of our history, but they without a doubt did not cover the history of Indigenous people like they should have at all.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I learned a lot more about Christopher Columbus and that than I did about the Indigenous people.
I know, yeah. And the ship Hector, that came to Nova Scotia, oh my god, I don't think there was more to learn about that. We know everything there is. But yeah, they kind of skipped over the Indigenous history. Okay, so I'm just going to go into a short history lesson about residential schools and kind of the history of Indigenous people in Canada. So residential schools were first opened in the 1800s by the Canadian government, and they were administered by the churches, largely the Catholic Church. What led to the residential schools was the European settlers, coming over, taking over the land, and they believed that they were superior, that their civilization was kind of the pinnacle of human achievement, and they needed to basically teach the uncivilized, quote, savages the European way of life. So according to an article written by Aaron Hansen, Daniel Gamez, and Alexa Manuel for the Indigenous Foundations from the University of British Columbia, the Canadian Indigenous schools were designed after their American counterparts, and they adopted the, quote, aggressive civilization example that the US had within their industrial schools for Indigenous children. So I guess the US history could be pretty similar to Canadian history for Indigenous children. So the goal of these schools was to get them while they were young and to try and eliminate any trace of their Indigenous roots. More than 150,000 children were forcibly taken from their parents, taken from their homes, and they were made to live in these schools. They weren't even allowed to speak their native language most of the time, and they were often physically punished if they did speak their language. I mean, these kids didn't know any other language, so it was like they weren't really allowed to talk. So the conditions in these schools were deplorable. They were underfunded. There was many children that went to class part-time, and then the rest of the time they worked for the schools. Like, girls did things like laundry and cleaning, while the boys did maintenance of the school and agriculture. Of course, all this was like involuntary work, and it was unpaid. There was physical, sexual, and emotional abuse that ran rampant throughout the schools, and so did sickness amongst the kids that lived there. So astonishingly, these schools ran for like 150 years in Canada, and the last one wasn't closed until 1996. 1996, like, that still blows my mind at how, you know, close these schools were. Like, we were alive then, and they were still opened.
Yeah. So it's not like this is not some like ancient history of our past. Like, it starts then, but reaches into like modern times, more or less.
Yeah, it's pretty sad. In May of 2021, the bodies of 215 Indigenous children, some were as young as 3 years old, were found at one of the largest decommissioned residential schools in Kamloops, BC. And they found these bodies using ground-penetrating radar. So at the time that we're recording this, there's over 1,300 unmarked graves have been found at just 4 out of these 139 schools across Canada. And according to Ian Mosby and Aaron Millions for Scientific American, they quote that the official number of 4,120 students that were known to have died in the schools will end up being just a fraction of the actual total. So all of these children went to these schools, they just never came back, and a lot of them just had no explanations given to their family. They were just never seen again. So can you just imagine how horrible that would have been, and how, you know, horrible it probably still is for a lot of these families. So the Canadian government made a public apology in 2008 to the Indigenous communities across Canada, but this does little to even begin to reconcile the ongoing impacts that Indigenous communities across Canada are enduring. And quoting from the Indigenous foundations, the historic, intergenerational, and collective oppression of Indigenous peoples continues to this day in the form of land disputes, over-incarceration, lack of housing, child apprehensions, systemic poverty, marginalization, and violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA peoples, and other critical issues which neither begin nor end with residential schools, end quote. So with all of that, this is kind of like the beginning of our 4-episode mini-series that we're dedicating to the ongoing violence against Indigenous women and girls in Canada. So there are thousands of missing and murdered Indigenous women across Canada that have not seen justice, and these are just some of their stories that we're going to represent here. So according to an article written by Joanna Jolly for the BBC called Red River Woman, Aboriginal women are 4 times more likely to be murdered or go missing than other Canadian women. So the first case I'm going to talk about is Tina Fontaine's case. She's also known as the Red River Woman, and her story is what kind of added enough fuel to the fire to get the country's attention on the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. So although there were thousands of missing and murdered Indigenous women before Tina's murder in 2014 made headlines across Canada. In 2015, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women following Tina's death. It just kind of woke up the rest of Canada that may not have been paying attention to this serious situation, may not have noticed it was going on. It just kind of shed a lot of light onto the situation. But it's sad that it had to be, you know, this little 15-year-old girl to kind of wake Canada up. Wake up, Canada!
It actually blows my mind that it wasn't until 2014 that people started to, like, investigate into, like, these missing Indigenous women. Like it happened so long ago, like, back when residential schools were still open and stuff. And, like, it's sad to me, like, it took until 2014 for them to realize the seriousness of what was going on with the Indigenous women. But then still today, in like 2021, it's like everywhere now, and I feel like it's kind of like a little bit too late.
Yeah, like it took too long.
Like, it's sad those bodies were found, and it's sad about the residential schools, but like it's been going on for like decades, and it just breaks my heart that it took this long for anybody to pay attention.
Yeah, it's sad that they found those bodies. It's sad that it actually happened, and then it's sad that it took so long for, you know, everyone to wake up about this. Like, even thinking about myself, I think I kind of got in tune to the situation was when Loretta Saunders was murdered. And the only reason, not the only reason, but I think why it kind of got my attention was because she went to St. Mary's University, which is where I graduated. So I've kind of had that connection of, oh, this is super close to home. And so that's kind of where it opened my eyes. But yeah, it still took a while.
And I think, you know, obviously after the discovery of all those bodies this year, obviously it's much more like in the public consciousness, but still not even as much as I think is deserved, considering the amount of women that are still missing, the amount of, you know, women who literally just disappeared and either no investigation was done or very little was done. And I do just want to say, I know I was going to bring this up at some point during this like 4-part thing. I might as well say it now, but we're recording this episode around the same time that's this whole Gabby Petito case is happening. And that's a huge story that's like, you know, basically making headlines all around, you know, the US and Canada and the world. And I just think if even a fraction of attention that case has gotten was given to some of these murdered and missing Indigenous women in Canada, like, just think of the effect that could have, or like how many cases could be solved, or if, and as like when it's happening, not like 10 years later, but like as it's happening, if we saw something like that for one of these women, like just imagine what the case could have been, you know, a lot of these cases could have been solved. So I just wanted to like kind of say that it's crazy that that case, which is just, you know, a young, white, blonde hair, blue eyes girl, and not to say that that doesn't deserve attention, because it does, but so it's not like I want to give that less attention. I think it deserves that attention, but all these other cases need to be given that same amount of attention.
And like when I was like doing my cases and like learning about other people's cases as well for this miniseries, there wasn't a whole lot of information out there on like a lot of these women who went missing. A lot of them, they kind of just like, the police didn't really dig deep or didn't really seem to care, because there's like no information out there about hardly any of these women. And it's like nobody ever got justice. Well, maybe some of them did, but a lot of them, their parents have passed on and never got justice for their families or whatever. Like, there's just so much injustice in this that happened to these people that like it's actually sickening to me.
Yeah, so kind of to both your points there, like the Gabby case, I mean, that's only been unraveling for like a couple weeks, and there's already like YouTube videos with like millions of views. The people are so interested in this. And then what Steph was saying, when you look at some of these, you type in some of these missing Indigenous women, and there's like a paragraph about them, and they've been missing for decades or years, and you can't, there's nothing, you like Google it and there's like an article and that's it. Like you can't, there's nothing else about them. So it is sad how unrepresented they are in the media, for sure.
Yeah, and that's why, you know, yeah, like when we were looking at which cases we wanted to cover for this miniseries, like it was hard to find one that would actually, unfortunately, that would fill an whole entire episode, because some of them literally say this woman was last seen on this day, and that's it. That's literally all there is. There's like barely any investigation. There's no other information. So that's really sad.
Yeah, it is really sad. So back to Tina's case. Tina lived with her younger sister and her great aunt Thelma on an Aboriginal reserve north of Winnipeg, Manitoba. And Tina was happy at school. She had lots of friends, and she was the kind of person that would stand up for others when they were being bullied. She was kind of that person that people went to for kind of comfort and help. She wanted to be a social worker when she got out of school, so she was very much, you know, into helping people. Things started to shift for Tina in a really big way when her biological father was murdered in a bar fight one night. It was really unexpected. So as can be expected, Tina really struggled with this. Like, she was only 15 years old, and her aunt could see that happiness in Tina starting to fade away. So Tina began to have more and more contact with her biological mother, who lived in Winnipeg. They would kind of talk a lot more over the phone. And Tina was continuing to get really good grades at school, and what she really wanted was to go visit her mom in Winnipeg. And so as a reward, her aunt allowed her to do this. And I think just kind of based on the timeline of everything that happened, it was kind of during her summer break. So she was kind of planning on going for a couple months. Tina's aunt gave her some money, gave her a phone card, and told her to call her if she needed any help at all with anything. Like, she was always there, just call her. So Tina's visit with her mom really did not turn out the way that Tina was hoping. A lot of what happened while Tina was down in Winnipeg visiting her mom is largely unknown, but she would contact her younger sister saying that she had been beaten by her mom and her mom's boyfriend, and she would send pictures to her younger sister showing that she had bruises all over her, and she would send pictures of her doing drugs. According to that Red River Woman article, the last text that Tina sent to her sister was for her aunt and her aunt's husband, and it said, quote, "Tell Mama and Papa I love them and miss them, but I'm not ready to go home," end quote. So Tina was with her mom for about a month before she was reported missing. And in a Dateline special broadcasting episode with Lauren Murphy Oates and Kylie Gray, they talk to Tina's great aunt Thelma. And Thelma tells them how one night after Tina was reported missing already, the police did find her, and her name was flagged as missing and everything. She was intoxicated. She was obviously underage. She was only 15, but they said she looked even younger. Like, she looked like she was around 12. And the police, for whatever reason, still just let her go. And after that, she lost contact with everybody. And just a couple days after that, on August 17th, 2014, her body was found in the Red River. It was wrapped up in what some sources say was a garbage bag, some say it was a duvet, but it was weighted down by rocks and thrown in the river. Her body was in such a state of decomposition that it took investigators hours to determine that was even a female body that they had pulled from the river. And it took hours after that for them to make a tentative identification. And according to that Red River Woman article, it was a tattoo of angel wings on the back that helped them discover that it was Tina's body. 16 months after her body was found, they arrested a man named Raymond Joseph Cormier. He was charged with second-degree murder on December 8th, 2015. But he pleaded not guilty, and he was actually acquitted, so Tina's murder has never been solved. Recently, on March 16th, 2021, Raymond Cormier was arrested in Ottawa for allegedly breaking into several apartments. So he obviously has issues whether he committed this murder or not, but her murder is still unsolved. So the Red River, which is where Tina's body was found, it runs through Winnipeg, Manitoba. It's about 885 kilometers long, and 255 kilometers are actually in Canada. The rest of it flows northward from Minnesota and North Dakota in the United States, and it flows through the Red River Valley, and it ends in Lake Winnipeg. Now, the city of Winnipeg has a larger Indigenous population than any other Canadian city, and it's known for its high murder rate, and it has gained the nickname Murderpeg for its high rate of violence. There are many very remote Indigenous communities that surround Winnipeg, and these communities are almost like Canada's forgotten people. These communities are full of poverty, they have very little resources, some of the living conditions are terrible. Some families live in condemned houses with multiple families all in one house. And so it's really common for teenagers, especially teenage girls, to want to escape their living situations here, and so they travel to the closest city, which is Winnipeg. And of course, once they get there, they don't have anything. They don't have anywhere to live. They don't have family, a lot of them. And at this point, they're considered runaways by police. A lot of them get into sex work and really dangerous lifestyles, drug abuse, alcohol. And they become really easy prey for predators when they go missing, because their families really have no way of knowing that they've disappeared right away. And there's many, many reports of police not taking these cases as seriously as they should. And there's many accusations of racism in the police department, as apparently once the police hear that it's an Indigenous person, they just consider it a runaway and they lose interest right away. So they don't do as much investigating as they probably should, especially since these are underage, really vulnerable teenage girls. So the Red River itself in Winnipeg is related to a number of Indigenous cases. while police were still investigating Tina's murder, like back in the early days when it happened, another teenage Indigenous girl was found on the banks of the Assiniboine River, which right before it connects to the Red River, so it's the same body of water. This girl's name was Renelle Harper. She was found half naked, unconscious, and the temperature outside was -3°C, so that's like 27 degrees Fahrenheit. But police say that the low temperature actually helped keep her alive, because when it's that cold, the body starts to slow down its metabolism and it can start healing itself. Of course, to a point until it gets too cold for too long and then you freeze to death. But Renelle actually did survive, though. And her story was that she was out with friends and she was lured under an isolated bridge by two young men. And when they got her there alone, they sexually assaulted her and they physically attacked her. She ended up in the river, but she doesn't exactly know how she got in there. She doesn't remember if she ran in there to get away from them or if they threw her in. But she does know that she made it to shore, and when she got there, they attacked her again, and then they just left her for dead. And those men that same night went on to sexually assault another woman as well. I don't know who these men were, if they were caught. I feel like they were because they know that they attacked somebody else, but there really isn't much out about that. And Renelle waived her right to stay anonymous, and she spoke out about her case to try and help others that were victims of assault and murder. So even before Tina's body was found in the Red River, there had been tragedy surrounding it. In March of 2003, a 16-year-old girl named Felicia Solomon Osborne went to school one day, but she never returned home. Her family put up missing persons posters, and this was another example that they felt the police really didn't do enough or anything to try and find her. Sadly, 3 months after she went missing, on June 11th, 2003, while conducting routine dock maintenance, police discovered a severed leg that had washed up on the shore of the Red River. And then 5 days after that, a man that was out for a walk found an arm that had washed up on shore as well. And they found that both of these limbs belonged to Felicia. And her murder is still unsolved as well. But that's really all there is out there about these cases. There was another woman named Bernadette Smith and her friend Kyle Kemich. They believe that there's other women waiting to be found in the Red River, and they have begun searching for themselves. They kind of dragged the bottom of the river on their own, searching for bodies. Bernadette's half-sister Claudette Osborne was last seen in July of 2008. Maybe her sister could be in this river. The last time anyone heard from Claudette was through phone messages that she had left on answer machines that she'd left at 4 o'clock in the morning one day. Apparently, she had been bleeding really bad and she was being attacked by a man, and she was like calling everyone that she knew for help. But it's kind of weird. Apparently, she was using a calling card that had run out of credit, so it was days before anyone even got these messages. I'm not really sure how that works. That was like 2003. Calling cards are weird. But needless to say, it was too late, and she's never been found either. Kyle's sister, so Kyle Kemich, who I just mentioned, his sister Amber also went missing in 2010. Never been found. After Tina's body was found, Kyle co-founded the foundation called Drag the Red. It's a volunteer foundation where they search and drag the bottom of the Red River looking for bodies. And they just feel like they don't really have a lot of support from police. Police aren't doing this. It's kind of a volunteer community that has to do it themselves. And according to CTV News, in September of 2014, volunteers found bones at the bottom of the river. They found a blood-stained pillowcase, a bloody carpet, and there was dentures found that were all handed over to the police. In 2015, they found teeth scattered along the shore. So these are all examples of like they're finding things in the river. Nothing has come out about whose DNA, like whose bones, whose teeth these were, but they're finding body parts in the river. So sadly, Kyle, who was a co-founder of this organization, he passed away just on September 2nd of 2021. He was only 38. He unexpectedly passed away, but his daughter is going to help continue on with the work of Drag the Red. And it's just, I mean, it's really encouraging that these communities are coming together to solve this, but it's like, where are the police with these kind of things, right? Like maybe they are helping, maybe they're putting in some funding, but it just seems like it shouldn't come down to family members that are missing people that have to kind of go through this to find their family members. What do you guys think so far?
I think it's really sad that volunteers were looking for these body parts. Like, that kind of shows that the police just shoved it under the rug and didn't really seem to care. Like, I just don't understand, like, the injustice of that.
Maybe they didn't have like probable cause, and they, they can't just go looking everywhere. Somebody thinks there might be something.
But like, even if you found like dentures or like something, you can find DNA from that, and can't you find out who these people were?
Yeah, and I mean, they handed all this stuff over to police, so I don't know if they have been able to match them. I couldn't find anything that came out for positive IDs, so yeah, it's really sad.
Like, I just don't understand why like these Indigenous women are just getting such poor, like, there's no outcry. Like, nobody, like, the police don't really seem to care about these women, and it's just like, I don't know, I just don't understand. That's all. I don't, even when I do my case, like, we'll hear about that later, but when I do my case, there's just like nothing, and nobody seemed to do anything about it. I'm just like, why? That's my biggest question. Why aren't people doing anything about these women?
Yeah, and in another case, a woman named Jennifer Catchway disappeared, and she's not related to the Red River, but I mean, her family basically every year after the snow melts, they go out and search for her body. They dig through the landfills. They're digging through these mounds of dirt. They're digging through anything that they think someone would want to dump a body, and it's them going out themselves with equipment and just shovels looking for bones of their daughter, because they think the police have basically just, written them off. And this family said that when they did first report her missing to the police, apparently the police were like, oh, how old is she? She had just turned 18, and then they knew that this was an Indigenous family, and they said, oh, she's probably just out drinking, give her a week, she'll come back. And that's kind of the attitude that everyone says. It's like, oh, the police find out that's Indigenous. Oh, they're just out partying. They're probably out doing drugs and they're drunk. They'll come back in a week or so. Because there's that stigma, that like Indigenous people that's kind of all they do is, party and drink. And there is like addiction and alcohol issues that are in these communities because of kind of all this that has happened in the past. The systemic racism that's still happening. It's causing these larger issues for these communities. And so as Winnipeg is just one of these examples where Indigenous women are targeted for violence and murder because they are living on the margins of society. There was a man named Sean Lamb. He was dubbed a serial killer, and he was convicted of killing 2 Aboriginal girls in Manitoba. And he described them as, quote, the perfect victims, because as that Red River article explains, no one really seems to care if they go missing. So it's just easy to pick off these girls. And there's also have you guys ever heard of the serial killer Robert Pickton from Vancouver?
Yes, I have.
Me too.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm not going to go into it, but Robert Pickton, he was convicted of killing 6 women, but he was originally charged with 26 counts of murder. And he even said himself that he actually murdered 49 women. And he wanted to make it an even 50, but he was caught before he was able to. But many of his victims were Indigenous women from the downtown east side of Vancouver, kind of living that dangerous lifestyle on the streets. Like, a lot of these bodies have never been found. There was just DNA from a lot of Indigenous women at his gross house and farm. So
he was the pig farmer, right?
Yeah, he was the pig farmer that, I mean, some sources say that he fed some of his victims to his pigs. I'm not sure if that's true. What I've heard is that he kind of, the remains of his victims, he would kind of put them in with the bodies of slaughtered animals and bring them out to like the rendering farms so that everything was mixed together. There was no way to know what was what. Maybe both are true, but like his story, he was just like a gross guy, and like he would just pick up these sex workers, and obviously he just killed a lot of them, and a lot of them were Indigenous. And the police didn't do a lot. This was like in the 1980s. For like a couple decades he was doing this, and the police were kind of not looking into it as much as they should have, because they were, again, these marginalized, sex workers that lived on the street. So it's just another sad situation. So you can definitely like feel the desperation of the situation just by these few cases that I've talked about, but there's hundreds, like even thousands across the country. If you go to cbc.ca/missing and murdered, you can see the profiles of 250 of these cases. They're still working on more, but that's what we were talking about before. You click on one of these names and it's just like a paragraph, or sometimes just a sentence about what happened to these people. These girls that are missing, some of them are murdered and just unsolved, and there's nothing else to go on. So, I mean, it really is a problem. This is just one example that's happening in Winnipeg, Manitoba, but it's across Canada. And yeah, we're going to talk about more in our other upcoming episodes.
And a lot of predators too, like they know that they're more likely to get away with it if they target this community, because they know the police are gonna not be looking into these disappearances, and they know, I guess it's probably for a lot of like serial killers or murderers in general, they do prey on the vulnerable populations. But just like if you're someone who's trying to get away from the police and evade the police, it makes sense that you would target people who it's going to be like 10 years before they even like start looking, and then by that time everything will be there'll be no evidence left. So it makes it so much easier for these people to get away with it too.
Yeah, and I think that is why these people can just get picked off. They're in these dangerous situations already, and they're living these lifestyles where they're maybe not checking in every day with their family because they're not living with their family. Some of them, they're like hundreds of miles away from their actual family, so there's no way for them to know they're even missing. And the ones that do have family close by, like their lifestyle is they can be gone for weeks or months at a time and then come back. So they could be missing for months before people even really know. There was this other case that I was looking at, and this woman had disappeared, but she'd kind of left her family, like that was her decision. She wanted to leave. She was only like 17 or 18, but anyway, she actually didn't get reported missing. Like, if you guys think, how long do you think would be like an absurd amount of time before someone gets reported missing, like just off the top of your head?
Like a couple of weeks, probably.
Yeah, I would say like a couple weeks or to a month, maybe.
Okay, this person didn't get reported missing for 40 years. And like their family knew he was out there somewhere. They just assumed like she just didn't have contact for 40 years. And finally someone was like, probably something fucking happened to her.
40 years? That doesn't even like
it seems ridiculous. And it's like they talked, like, I mean, it was officially whether like, yeah, let's file a missing persons report to like open a case. But they had talked to like maybe friends and family and even police about like, yeah, we're not really sure where she is, but we know that she doesn't really want to be found. So it was kind of like, well, that's like, we know she wants to be gone, but they knew she was not with them. Like they knew she was somewhere, but they just didn't actually report her missing for 40 years. And she hasn't been seen, obviously, for 40 years. So it's just kind of crazy.
But why after 40 years would you file a report? Like it doesn't really make sense to me. Like, if she didn't want to be seen and nobody's ever heard from her, why take 40 years to be like, oh, maybe she's missing?
But probably because, they still thought about her throughout all the years. Maybe they're just like, if someone sees her, she's actually missing, then they can report that they've seen her. Maybe she'll actually come forward and say, this is where I am. Like she probably changed her name, has a like that's what they're hoping, that she changed her name, had a family of her own, and just kind of started somewhere else. And they're thinking maybe if they report her missing, that she'll come forward. Someone sees her, they'll report it. Where if they don't report her missing, no one is going to do that because they don't know.
But would the police even like investigate something that's been like 40 years missing? I feel like that's not something they would. I mean, they don't really do a lot of investigation with people who go missing like 2 weeks for Indigenous people. But I'm just saying, like 40 years is kind of a long time. Like, would they even open in a case for that?
I don't know. I feel like they'd probably like have to for the law. Like someone reports them missing, they kind of open it up. But whether they're gonna like search for her until they find her, I doubt that. Although, I mean, some of her family, think she's probably out there. A lot of them, back of their mind probably think something happened to her early on and just her body's just never been like identified even. So, yeah.
And it's crazy because when you think about it, yeah, it's been 40 years. She could, something could have happened to her. She could have been killed, the first year after she was not seen. So it's been 39 years since she was alive. So, what are the chances of the police actually finding anything of substance 39 years later, if they haven't already? But I mean, also too, maybe they did find, like, a lot of bodies do get, I mean, I don't know the process, but a lot of bodies do get fined and they can't identify them. And so they're just like kind of known as Jane Doe or something. So like maybe she had been found, but she just hadn't been linked to that person before.
Yeah, exactly. She could have been one of those unknown bodies. And I think eventually they bury them as a Jane Doe or something. So I don't know. They just don't know. Anyway, it's just really sad.
Yeah, and it's crazy because as you'll see, like in the other cases we talk about and stuff, like obviously every case is a little bit different, but the same kind of systemic issues are still there in every single one of these cases. And a lot of the, police attitude is the same in a lot of them. Like the one that I'm going to talk about, it's much different than like the 40 years one, because, you know, her family was kind of advocating her for this person like almost immediately. But you still see a lot of, you know, the attitude of the police of like, oh, they'll turn up, you know, it's fine. We're not going to like waste money to like investigate something that might not even be a missing person case. So it's going to be like, you'll see a lot of the same patterns in these cases that we're going to talk about.
And I find like when it comes to like Indigenous women, like I found like the police were like, oh, well, like if they were like a transient or like someone who was living like in a bad situation, like maybe like the police always say like, well, maybe they're just like high on drugs or whatever, and they like don't want to be found. And I feel like that's kind of like the stereotype they get too sometimes, like that type of case. But I'm just like, they're still a person, whether they're living a rough life or living like in the middle of nowhere. Like they're missing somebody, they're family to somebody, and they're missing, and somebody reported them missing. Like I don't know how you can just be like, oh well, they're probably just off doing drugs or whatever, and they don't want to be found. Like why? Who gets to make that decision? Like I don't understand.
And I think that attitude exists not even just in the Indigenous community, but just people who are transient lifestyle, just no matter who they are, like, you know, people who are living on the streets, who are homeless or addicted to drugs. Like that's kind of the police attitude for all of those cases. But I was going to say too, I think also the police, like the total lack of care is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because they say, oh, well, there's so many missing Indigenous women, or so many of them, you know, turn up, or they're not missing, so we're not even going to try. But like the reason that so many are missing is because they don't try. So it's like, if they tried, when these get reported, there'd be less missing. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of like becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I mean, nobody wants to hear like from the police, you know, give it a week, like we're not going to start looking because they're probably going to show up, right? I mean, that nobody wants to hear that. And that Dateline episode that I had talked about earlier with Jennifer Catchway, when they were saying that the officer was like, oh, give her a week, she's probably partying, like they did talk to one of the RCMP employees, and she was saying that she talked to that employee and that actually he never said that didn't happen. And she said that that particular officer was actually of Indigenous background himself, so it's not something that he would have said. I'm thinking like it could be true either way, like, or it could be a little bit of both, you know, maybe because he's in the Indigenous community, you know how people say, oh, you can't really be racist against your own race. So maybe it was like, oh, I'm a part of that community, it's okay if I say something like that, you know, like we're on the same page here, you know what I mean? So that could have happened. He doesn't want to admit it. Or maybe the family's just so distraught that they got him mixed up with somebody else, or maybe somebody else had said that and they just thought it, you know what I mean? So it could be both sides, a little bit of both, truth on both sides. Either way, I don't think people are intentionally lying about it, but I mean, there's a whole report from the RCMP about this kind of thing.
But there is a lot of internalized stigma and racism too. Like just because you are part of that community doesn't mean, you know, like you've been told a certain thing, or you've seen that behavior so often in your own community or towards your own community. Like a lot of people internalize that and like can even become like negative about their own community, or like racist, or not racist, but you know what I mean? Like a lot of people internalize that, and then their actions kind of go against the community too, because they're just so used to that. And so that is a factor too that comes up. So he could have very well said that if, you know, people internalize that sort of thing. And like, yeah,
that's very true. And also, while I was doing this research for this case, you know, a lot of Indigenous people do recognize that there is an issue with alcohol and drugs in their communities. Like that's a thing that they are, you know, having to deal with and live with. Just like with any community, there are some people that are in that lifestyle and, you know, don't want to get out. They don't want to make the effort to get out. Or they're very like, you know, the world's against me, so I'm not even going to try. Like they have those people. And of course, just like everybody else, but just that doesn't make them, you know, worthy of not being helped when they need help. So yeah, I think there still is a lot of racism that isn't being addressed in the RCMP and in Canada in general.
Yeah. And isn't it, like I don't want to get too technical or too like not academic, but like isn't there like a thing, learned helplessness? Like that's a thing. Like when I might be quoting this completely wrong, so maybe if I am, we can edit this out. But isn't it like it's a thing, learned helplessness? It's like when you learn over time, nothing that you do is going to matter.
Well, it's like you can't make a difference, so why even try, kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and there are cases where some kids were taken away and they went to these residential schools for like growing up their entire lives. And so they never were around like loving parents. So they never knew what that was like. And they have kids of their own and they never learned how to be like a loving, nurturing parent. So they pass that down to their kids. And it's kind of like maybe not abusive, but maybe some of it is like this abusive, non-nurturing, non-supportive family because that's all they knew because they grew up in this like horrible residential school. So that gets passed down, like these kinds of things. And so a lot of those issues, like I said, are still present in these communities.
Yeah, like intergenerational trauma, like a lot of those issues and systemic issues in those communities are linked to residential schools directly through the generations. So the alcohol or the addiction, mental health struggles in the community, like all of that is directly linked to that. And people are still dealing with that on a daily basis. And that's, like I said, the root of a lot of those issues. So you have to kind of get to the root of the issue. You have to acknowledge the trauma has happened and you have to learn how to deal with it and move on and heal. And then the other issues that come from that it'll be easier to solve those issues.
Yeah, exactly. Like you think of people that lived through that and now they're adults and they have to deal with this somehow. Like that's how they deal with it, is like this alcohol and drugs, or they maybe didn't go to those schools themselves, but they had children that did, and those kids just never came back. Like, how do you get over that? There's no help from the government. So a lot of people turn to drugs and alcohol because of that. Like they have nowhere else to go, and just, so it really did all stem from these residential schools, which obviously was a big, mistake. And there's no way for us to like fix it except for offering them support now. That's really what we can do. So, yeah.
Yeah. And just a little callback to our interview with Amy Bryant when she said trauma is the gateway drug versus any substance itself. Like a lot of it starts with trauma. So once, that leads to a lot of these addiction and other issues. So it's very present in the Indigenous community for sure. And
like over a century, like 150 years, these schools were open. So can you imagine how much distrust these communities probably still have with the government and, with law enforcement because of, they're the ones that did this to them. So I can totally understand this like disconnect and this, I don't want anything to do with the government. And that's why there's still all these remote reserves away from the cities. And it's just like, yeah, it's big. Like a lot of them don't even have like clean running water. And I mean, that's like the government should get on that. Like, where's the government when these communities need water? Like, so there's still a lot the government could be doing that they're not.
Yeah, like some communities are still under a boil water advisory. They have been for decades. When you think of Canada, you think of, it's a pretty, wealthy country.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, everyone should have access to clean running water. Like, there really is no excuse except for the government does not give two shits. That's all it is.
Yeah, and some politicians pretend to care when they need your vote and then completely bail on those issues later. That's against whatever. I'm not going to get in political, but you, those of you listening know who I'm talking about. So, well, if you're Canadian, you do.
Yeah, we just had another $600 million election for an outcome that was the exact same as it was. Like, where that $600 million could have went to, clean water for Indigenous communities. Like, fucking start there, not do a whole new election. Like, just do something good with your money, please. For once. Yeah,
that's our little PSA, I guess. We're fresh off an election, guys. This is how we're feeling. So.
Yeah, it's awful. There's still a lot of work to be done, and
yeah, I mean that's a good episode to kind of kick off our mini series, like you said, because like Tina Fontaine, murder and everything kind of ignited it on like a widespread level. Like it was always, I think, obviously, like there were people who were advocating for the community and stuff for a long time before that, but that was what really brought it to like the wide public's consciousness. So it's a good way to like start off the mini series, as we say, because now we can tell a lot of other stories, and some of the stories happened obviously it just before Tina Fontaine's murder, but
we could have like a whole series of just cases of Indigenous women.
I mean, yeah, we could have like a whole season of it. But the thing is, like, you couldn't have more than 1 or 2 episodes about one person. You'd have to, you know what I mean, because there's so little about each person.
Yeah, which is unfortunate because there's like nothing out there on probably half of the people that are missing or murdered.
Yeah, so stick around for the next couple of weeks to learn more about missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. We will see you next week.
Stay tuned for part 2. We'll see you next week for part 2.
You can find us on Facebook at Crime Family Podcast, on Instagram at Crime Family Podcast. We also have a Twitter, Crime Family Pod 1. And also, if you have any case suggestions or any tips or tricks in the podcasting world, you can email us at crimefamilypodcast@gmail.com. So we really love hearing from you and hope to continue to do so. Okay, see you next time. Bye.
Bye.